Thank you for that. So, I have a few things to say at the beginning. The first thing is that I have changed the title a little bit. So now it is the Theosophical Movement and the Construction of Esoteric National Identities in Italy in the first half of the 20th century. The second thing is that I think it's very good that my paper follows up on Victoria's paper, because you will see that there are quite a few analogies and connections between the two papers, so I think this is interesting. And what is the third thing? I think I forgot. Well, okay, if I forgot, it's not so important. So, in my paper, I would like to focus on the way in which identitarian discourses were constructed and promoted by Italian authors who were influenced by theosophical ideas in the first half of the 20th century. By identitarian, I mean in particular discourses that participate in the construction of a national or ethnic identity. My argument is that the theosophical movement could offer a convenient environment for the production of such discourses. This is not to say that in that period the theosophical movement was inherently nationalist or chauvinistic. In fact, one could easily find arguments to support the opposite thesis. The theosophical movement, understood in a broad sense, spread internationally almost from the very beginning. And the first object of the Theosophical Society, which you all know, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, would seem to be incompatible with identitarian discourses of any kind. Furthermore, various theosophical and post-theosophical organizations were mercilessly persecuted by the fascist regimes in Italy, Germany, and other European countries. What these regimes could not tolerate, and found at odds with their totalitarian ideology, was the marked internationalism and universalism of these organizations, and particularly of the Adia branch of the Theosophical Society. This is something that you see very often when you have a look, especially at the police reports in the archives. However, it also seems evident that some elements of the theosophical doctrinal system could easily lend themselves to the construction of identity discourses. I find that the two elements are particularly significant in this respect. So, the idea of tradition and the idea of race. Both elements have a prominent presence in theosophical doctrines and are essentially plastic, in the sense that they can be adapted to different situations and contexts in order to validate different kinds of discourse, which may or may not take on an identitarian form. Whether or not theosophical ideas were combined with an identitarian discourse, it surely depended on the particular context in which they were being transmitted and spread. And this seems to be the case particularly with Italy, which, when the theosophical movement made its first appearance, was still a relatively young state. And now I remember what was the third thing I wanted to say, is that I am going to focus, of course, on the presence of the theosophical movement in Italy, but I'm not going to dwell so much on details about this history, because this paper is basically building upon an essay that I first published in Italian in a collective volume on the history of esotericism in Italy that was published 3 years ago. And now it has appeared recently in the latest issue of Theosophical History in an English version. So if you want to have the small details, the minute details about the history of the Theosophical movement in Italy, well, then you read the essay. The first noticeable presence of circles of persons interested in Theosophy, in Italy of course, dates from the early 1890s. This was 30 years after the country had achieved its unity and independence, and only 20 years after the conquest of Rome from the pontifical state, which brought the project of Risorgimento to near completion and gave Italy its capital city. It is not difficult to see that in the decades following these events, Italian intellectuals felt it as a duty and a challenge to participate in the construction of a national identity that would match the newly created state. This was, of course, a situation that was not devoid of contradictions and fragility, with passions that could easily swing from dreams of restored grandeur to inferiority complexes towards other European powers. This helps explaining why, when Theosophy was taking its first steps in Italy, an idea began to shape of exploring esoteric traditions in a national spirit. And this developed partly in opposition and partly as an alternative to other discourses focusing on other sources of esoteric wisdom, such as the Oriental one, especially dear to the strict Blavatskians of the society, but also Nordic Western one, which had among its highlights Paracelsus, Jakob Böhme, Rosicrucianism, and German Naturphilosophie, and of which Rudolf Steiner, to some extent, could be considered as the most recent representative. In opposition to the emphasis on the Oriental or Northern currents of esoteric tradition, some Italian authors developed the idea of an Occidental but Southern stream of esoteric tradition. It should be noted, however, that the emergence of an Italian way to esotericism was not just an affair of the Italian branch of the Theosophical Society. It is in fact also connected to the concept of a Hermetic Italic school that took shape during these years, same years as the beginning of the Theosophical Society in Italy, with Giuliano Kremer's circle, and to that of the Pythagorean Italic tradition that was later elaborated by Arturo Regini and his associates, and to which I will return later. There is some evidence that the international leadership of the society encouraged the Italian members to go in this direction. For instance, in her first speech for the Italian section, which was held in 1904, Annie Besant defined Rome as the occult center of the West. Quotation. The wish to rediscover an esoteric tradition that was specifically Italian led some members of the Italian section, including the then secretary Decio Calvari, you have a picture here, and young prominent members such as Arturo Regini and Balbino Giuliano, to study the Neoplatonic and Hermetic flowering of the Italian Renaissance. Interestingly, this was several years before it became the chosen field of research on the part of distinguished academics, beginning especially in Italy with Paul Oscar Cristella and Eugenio Garan. Everything suggests that this was not a mere casual commonality of intention, but a deliberate program. We can actually see this program outlined by Calvari in 1904 during the first convention of the European section of the Theosophical Society. Calvari was leading the Italian group represented at this European convention, and he was then the secretary of the Italian section. And there is this interesting quote. Another project has also begun and will be much developed in the coming autumn. So it's basically the program for the next year. It consists of the particular study of our, which means Italian mystical tradition, which has so many points of contact with our, in this case the Theosophical Society's, teaching, as shown by researches into the works of the great writers and thinkers of the Renaissance. Through the founding of a philosophical religious library and the Society for Public Lectures, we will attempt to revive in Florence the great Neoplatonic idea that had such great representatives in the 15th century, such as Marsilio Ficino and Leonardo da Vinci. This report, presented by Calvari at the European Convention, bears witness to a keen interest of Italian theosophists in figures such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, and even in minor ones, such as the 17th century alchemist Giuseppe Borri, who was Calvari's particular object of research. He actually published a book on him. One of the most salient examples of this tendency comes from Balbino Giuliano, a member not yet 30 years old, who was destined to become in 1929, after a brilliant academic and political career, the fascist Minister of National Education. In 1904, Giuliano published a book on the esoteric doctrine of Marsilio Ficino. It was a long polemical tirade against the monumental history of the Florentine Platonic Academy by the historian Arnaldo della Torre, which was published 2 years earlier. Giuliano's basic argument was that della Torre had an apologetic agenda in his book, wanting at all costs to make Ficino a good Orthodox Catholic. Giuliano considered this idea unfounded and instead emphasized the heretical and esoteric aspects of Ficino's works, while pointing out analogies of his thought with modern theosophical doctrines, especially in Besant's version. The attempt fitted within the idea of rereading of the great authors of the Italian Renaissance as representatives of a particular esoteric tradition, bringing to light aspects the scholars had long chosen to ignore. Another interesting example is an article on Giordano Bruno, published by the young Arturo Regini in the journal Leonardo a few years later, 1906, when Regini was still very much involved in the Theosophical Society. There, Regini underlined Bruno's magical and Pythagorean aspects, contrasting them with the positivist interpretations of the time that saw Bruno mainly as a martyr for free thought and modern science. One should certainly not insist too much on the comparison, but Regini seems to have anticipated here the vision of Bruno as hermetic magus that Francis Yates would propose in the 1960s, and which, in spite of all later adjustments and revisions, had led to a profound reassessment of Bruno's work. And as I said, I will return to Regini later. The spread of the Theosophical movement in Italy did not only stimulate research into the historical roots of an indigenous esoteric tradition. A similar process of identity formation was taking place in other contexts, as one can see from an extremely interesting passage from Calvari's report to the European Theosophical Convention of 1904, so the same report. And here we have a quote. I would like to mention the recent foundation in Livorno of a group consisting entirely of Jewish Italian members, very intelligent and enthusiastic. For the future, the Italian section of the Theosophical Society, of course, has great hopes for them. Theosophy and its teachings are not a new language for them, for they are all students and admirers of the philosophical and theological works of the great Rabbi Elia Ben-Amosek, misspelled, by the way, who several years before the Theosophical Society was founded, was writing about theosophy and speaking of reincarnation, as he had discovered it in the Talmud. The president of the group, Rabbi Arrigo Lattes, was a pupil of Elia Ben-Amosek, and he spurred on to work ardently for the theosophical cause by devotion to his master and admiration for our doctrines, which are partly a confirmation of ideas already familiar to him. And here you have an image also of Elia Ben-Amosek. While it is true that some Italian intellectuals of Jewish origin joined or sympathized with the Theosophical movement without being led thereby to a deeper appreciation of Jewish religion, and there are a few examples of this, it is all the more remarkable that for others the adhesion to Theosophy went along with the feeling of identity as they participated in a living Judaism that had already rediscovered its mystical side independently of Theosophical influence. Ben-Amosek was one of the most important and influential figures of Italian Judaism in the second half of the 19th century, and had created a school of disciples around him in Livorno, the city where he spent most of his life. His main project was to show how traditional Kabbalah was perfectly compatible with rational philosophy and with some of the latest trends of European thought. Contrary to the predominant trends in Judaism in his time, including Italian Judaism, Kabbalah represented for Ben-Amosek the core of Jewish religious experience, but the core that could also speak to the mind of the modern man, because it could be interpreted in the light of contemporary philosophy. Ben-Amosek died in 1900, and it does not appear that he had the time to familiarize himself with the new movement of Theosophy and develop a particular opinion about it. From a political point of view, the interesting aspect is that Ben-Amosek was close to the ideals of the Italian Risorgimento, wholeheartedly endorsing the process of unification of the country. Not only that, he was particularly close to Giuseppe Mazzini and Mazzinian circles, who represented the radical, democratic, and republican wing of the Risorgimento. This is particularly interesting because it appears that the circle of his students that formed the Jewish Theosophical Lodge in Livorno were enthusiastic Zionists and engaged in polemical controversies with other members of the Jewish community who opposed Zionism, both in Livorno and elsewhere. This does not seem to be an extraordinary case, as Boaz has made clear in his analysis of Jewish theosophical groups elsewhere. But here we have an interesting aspect in the fact that their Zionism could also be nourished by their positive attitude towards the Risorgimento. It should be remembered, in fact, that the formation of the new Italian state brought about improved social status for Italian Jews. The conflict between the newly born Italian state and the Catholic Church, made inevitable by the fact that the pontifical state was an obvious obstacle to the completion of the unification process, had in fact favored the emergence of a secular attitude from the Italian government, which obviously benefited all religious minorities. But in a Zionist perspective, the Risorgimento could be important for this Jewish group also in another sense, namely as a very powerful and inspiring model of action towards national awakening and emancipation, which should ultimately lead to the creation of a new state. It is noteworthy, therefore, that these political interests and passions, on the one hand, and the study of Kabbalah on the basis of Ben Amozeg's teachings on the other, would be combined with the direct involvement in the Theosophical Society, and in the affirmation of a cultural and ethnic specificity with the creation of a Jewish lodge. And here you have also a picture of Arrigo Lattes, who was the leader of this Jewish Theosophical group in Livorno. And now I would like to get back to Regini. We have seen the way in which the Italian Theosophists began to look back at Renaissance currents of Hermetism and magic in order to construct the genealogy of an Italian esoteric tradition that would give them the feeling of not being just the representatives of a newly imported movement, but also the descendants of a specifically Italian esoteric tradition. We also saw how some Italian Jewish Theosophists tried to follow a different but analogous path in linking up Kabbalah, Zionism, and Theosophy. But there is more. Some authors who had been significantly influenced by Theosophy looked for a further validation of a specifically Italian esoteric tradition. There is more particularly the idea to go back to ancient pre-Christian sources. From this perspective, it is not difficult to imagine what would be the most suitable candidates to fulfill this role. Obviously, ancient Rome and all the various forms of religious practice that developed on Italian soil during its very long history. And this would include, among other things, Etruscan religion, for instance, and most importantly, the tradition of Pythagoreanism. It was the latter, in fact, Pythagoreanism, that for several authors began to be considered as the main current through which the ancient Italic tradition was transmitted from the most ancient times. One of these authors was Alberto Gianola, a school teacher and a member of the Theosophical Society, who published a number of books on the Pythagorean tradition in the first decade of the 20th century. But the most interesting author in this respect is surely Arturo Regini, whom we have already encountered. But before I say something about him, it is important to keep in mind that the idea of an ancient esoteric Italic tradition does not begin with these early 20th century authors in the wake of the spreading of the Theosophical movement in Italy. The idea, in fact, is much older than that, and it has its roots already in the Renaissance and was particularly developed by the early 18th century Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico. What happens with early 20th century authors, influenced by Theosophy such as Regini, is that this idea becomes incorporated into a much grander scheme of competing world wisdom or esoteric traditions. For Regini, the idea of an Italic tradition, sometimes also called Mediterranean tradition or Occidental tradition, is supposed to have preeminence or priority with respect to Blavatskian and post-Blavatskian theosophical emphasis on Oriental tradition. And in this respect, it can be considered as an Italian or Southern European counterpart of the Hermetic reaction that had already manifested itself in Britain in the early 1880s against the perceived excessive emphasis on Oriental sources of Blavatsky and Theosophy. Now, just a few words about Regini's trajectory. How much time do you have left? 5 minutes.
You've got just over 5 minutes for the actual talk.
Now, Regini joins the Italian branch of the Theosophical Society when still very young. After a while, he was appointed as librarian of the Theosophical Library in Florence, which became a particularly important institution as a meeting point for radical intellectual milieus, and which was later renamed Philosophical Library. It was actually mentioned in the quotation that I gave you from Calvari earlier. And the library was used also for their researches by Florentine scholars of Renaissance Hermeticism, such as Eugenio Garen later, of course. Not long after, Regini quits the Theosophical Society and joins Freemasonry. So there is actually, he's taking distance from the Theosophical Society and embarks himself on the enterprise of the creation of a new Masonic obedience, which is called the Italian Philosophical Rite, which he did with another Italian author called Edoardo Frosini in 1911. And this was a disastrous enterprise. It lasted 2 years. One reason why it is interesting is that they linked up basically with the whole network of Masonic, fringe Masonic milieus all over Europe, including the Ordo Templi Orientis and Theodore Royce and Alistair Crowley. But after 2 years, basically, it collapsed. Now, in his readings at the time and in the coming years, Regini elaborates and presents his idea of an Italic tradition. Now, I would like to give you a quotation just to give an idea of what he means by this tradition, which sometimes is Italic, sometimes Mediterranean, and which is linked up also very strongly with Freemasonry, especially after he quits the Theosophical Society. The central idea of Masonic mysteries is therefore the ancient Mediterranean idea of privileged survival, which I think is what he means by conditional immortality, which was explained by Devini in his talks, of resurrection to immortality from death. To sum up, of palingenesis obtained through mystical death. It is the Egyptian, Orphic, Pythagorean, Hermetic idea. It is the main aim of the mysteries of Eleusis, of Cereres, of Mithra, and it is finally the basic idea implanted by Paul into Christianity. So basically it's a kind of syncretic idea of different Mediterranean traditions of antiquity which are brought together and which form the core of this Mediterranean tradition, which is supposed to have priority and preeminence with respect to the Oriental tradition. Now, the interesting thing about Regini is that the race element is not important in his case, and he usually only refers to tradition. Things are different, and I have to summarize here with another important author, which makes a striking kind of comparison with Regini, and this is Julius Evola. And things become different in his case. This is Evola. Because in the case of Evola, on the other hand, the notion of race becomes particularly important. Now, Evola has a particularly varied origin in terms of cultural education. So he's also strongly influenced by Regini, and only indirectly by Theosophical teachings. So he publishes in 1928 a book called Pagan Imperialism, which is actually very much influenced by Regini, and which is focusing very much on this idea of the Mediterranean tradition. But after that, soon after that, he has a conflict with Regini, so he has a clash with Regini, which ends up even in court and becomes particularly nasty. And after that, he converts himself to a totally different vision, which focuses more on a Nordic tradition. And there the notion of race becomes particularly important, and he is influenced very much by an Indian author, G.B. Tilak, who had published a book called The Arctic Home of the Vedas, which was based on the idea that in fact the Indo-Europeans were originally based in the polar Arctic Circle, and that from there they had migrated and they had invaded southern regions, so India and Europe, and they had especially dominated inferior races that were present there. So Evola takes up this idea, and this becomes, in fact, an idea that will dominate his thought from that moment on. And this is linked also to a particularly strong anti-Semite attitude, because he clearly says in his writings that, in fact, the Nordic populations and the Aryans are a superior race, and in fact, the move, the migration that they made was precisely destined to occupy the lands that were more hospitable for them, but which were basically occupied by the inferior races. Now, Evola was in fact also very much involved with the fascist regime, and also at one point with the Nazi regime. He collaborated with them, he even collaborated with the SS, and at one point he was appointed to do research particularly on secret societies in Europe in order to prove the veracity of all sorts of conspiracy theories that were spread. He even wrote a preface to the protocols of the elders of Zion. Now, to cut a long story short, here we have different models, different ways to create a discourse about identity. In the case of Regini, of course, this focuses very much on Italy. With Evola, it takes a totally different direction, because in fact he ends up in having a discourse that is not nationalistic at all in the end. And Italy is not relevant anymore because the focus is much more on the Nordic populations. Now, what I would like to say, just by way of conclusion, is that perhaps the Italian case is not really extraordinary, is not really an exception, but perhaps is a case that shows certain patterns in relation to identitarian discourses. And these are patterns that were likely to take shape in certain particular contexts, and this context will have to be analyzed then, of course, each individually for each case. And I think that if you consider other countries in Europe, like Spain, I am a little bit familiar with research on the Theosophical movement in Spain, and we heard what happened in Greece, which I think is extremely interesting, you find probably similar kind of patterns. Thank you very much.
Questions? Ola.
Yeah, this is just a detail that you were mentioning at the end. This book by JBT, like I was not familiar with, but the contents that, as you described them, remind me a lot of Guido Licht's ideas of the Aryo-Germans who come from the pole and who are sort of squeezed in. They are developing a unique culture, and once the Ice Age disappears, they spread over all the world, and all the luminaries of religion and all the major culture bearers are, of course, Aryo-Germans. So I'm just curious what the connections between this Indian author and Guido Licht is. At the same time.
Yes, to my knowledge, Evola does not refer so much to the Ariosophists. And if we look at the actual references, the explicit references about this particular story, he refers to Tilak and not to Guido von List and the other Ariosophists. If there is a connection between Tilak and the Ariosophists, on the other hand, I do not know. So this, I haven't looked.
But the stories are so very much
absolutely. But I think it was an idea that was really going around at the time. So yeah.
I think too. It's in the so-called folkish milieu. It's a widespread idea in reconstructing so-called Germanic history. I think you introduced us to a very interesting, for me, theoretical problem in analyzing theosophical history. Me, or perhaps a lot of us, have a perspective on the unifying elements of theosophy, of reacting on historicism by creating some level above whatever. And we are realizing on the basis of your contribution and of your contribution and of that what Boaz said, that we might look on theosophy as a movement which tells very national, cultural stories. And perhaps it might change the whole view on theosophy if we don't analyze this frame, which is always correct. It's always the attempt to overcome pluralism, but the stories which are told seem to be very special, very national, and so it would lead to dissolve a picture of the theosophical movement or society, but really to tell national, regional theosophical stories.
Yes. I think this is what I would consider part of the ambiguity of the history of the Theosophical movement, and I insist on defining it Theosophical movement because I would include in this not just the Theosophical Society in a proper sense, and even to talk about the Theosophical Society in a proper sense doesn't mean much because there are different Theosophical societies, of course. And I think it's really part of the ambiguity of the movement, and it's an ambiguity that we find again and again in different aspects. So it's about practice opposed to theory, it's about Oriental tradition opposed to Occidental or Hermetic tradition, it is about universalism opposed to national identities. So I think that in a way the discourse of the Theosophical movement was broad enough to include all of these things at the same time. So it was in a kind so ecumenical that there were the seeds to make all of these discourses grow and develop at the same time. And I think, for instance, we might read Steiner again in the light of this kind of idea and see how he deals, for instance, with Germanic populations or Germanic races. This is, for instance, a work that Staudenmayer has been doing, and I think it fits absolutely the kind of approach that I was trying to have here. So I think that it's just a way, perhaps, to reread the material and focus more on certain things that until now had passed through the lens, through the filter, because. Well, the first thing you think, the Theosophical movement was a universalistic movement, and of course it stressed the idea of unity and no importance given to creeds, castes, nations, and so on. But in fact, the moment it takes roots in a particular place, things become different. And I think it has to do a lot with the fragility of particular contexts.
Yeah, the question is this inherent in the theosophy, the system itself, or is it an additional aspect that comes? And what you suggest now is suggest a second answer. So it's not the problem of theosophy.
I think it is both. I think
That's
it is
what
both
I mean.
because
yeah.
this ambiguity potentially is probably already there in the very early writings of Madame Blavatsky.
Yes.
And the way in which she defines a certain kind of Oriental tradition, which is not a universal tradition at the end of the day, is a particular tradition that is located in a particular place, in a particular region, opens the door to people saying, there are other traditions also in other places that are important also, just like this one.
So, I mean, I understand. Of course, she was one of the key figures in the Indian national movement. So it's like, obvious that they have these two aspects. And some critics say that she decided to go to deal with that because of the failure of Krishnamurti, the split that was in the society. So it's, in this way it was like obvious that you have this aspect in the Theosophical Society. probably heard Annie Besant, when she was working for the Indian National Home or Self-Rule, so they could adopt it very easily.
To me, I think if I need a word to describe what was going on when Theosophy was in the air, was around, I would use the word empowering. For some reasons that is not so clear to define, there was a kind of element in Theosophy that helped people to construct things in a very creative way, for good and bad. Because in art you find exactly the same kind of situation. In literature also. You know, when Theosophy has an impact on people, all of a sudden you have people sort of getting crazy and starting to do things in a way that people were not doing before. Exactly how this relates, for instance, to particular experiences that can be vehiculated by, you know, teachings or these kind of things is something that I find also particularly interesting. I don't know if it plays a role in the political context also, but certainly plays a role in the artistic and literary context.
I don't know if that makes sense now, but my sense is there's some sort of a very deep structure embedded in, or expressed in the Theosophical movements, which is identical or part of, or expresses the same logic of nationalism, of modern nationalism, as a Western construction which is applied necessarily in its logic as universal. And I think the Theosophical Society does something, has the same perception. And from that point of view, I think there's this fit which enables really the Theosophical Society as to be an agent of local nationalities.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add here that I think one element is is the finding of the roots. The retracing of one source, finding the root and redefining history.
Yes. Yes.
And this means also
in a very precise structure, because you have to find.
If you think about the situation,
in different cultures. Yeah.
This applies certainly for Jewish communities, for instance, but it applies even to Italy. Italy, from a psychological point of view, if we can apply psychology to a country, is a country that is trying to understand what it is after it is unified, because of course there is this strong drive, this strong passion to get together, to create a new state, and so on and so forth. And once the state is there, okay, so who are we now? So now that we are together, and I think perhaps this is very analogous to Zionism. And
of course, you have to define this new imagined unity on some kind of basis, and cannot be, of course, one of the choices, by the way, in the case of Zionism. Esotericism wasn't there were other factors, but there was attempts to create it around esotericism, or what was understood as Jewish esotericism, that is Kabbalah, Hasidism, etc.
Helmut.
One little remark and a long remark. I object to speaking about, for example, unification of Italy. It's a construction of a new national state, and it's part of the ideology of the Risorgimento, just to unify whatever it was. And we're, I think, retelling this national myths. The perhaps more important point concerning theosophical history is, I would like to rescue a bit Annie Besant. She had the idea that, or she realized that there are national constraints and problems. And she had in her mind the idea that theosophy should be implemented in, let's say, national traditions in different ways. That was her offer to Rudolf Steiner, to say, you are going to make a German theosophy, and it would be different from theosophy in other countries. And she had a concept in mind which would integrate these national problems under the umbrella of theosophical thoughts. we might discuss whether this worked or not, and that's an ideology on its own. But she realized these problems in unifying, holding together society in these different countries. And that would be a case of research to look on Besant, because she's much more aware of the problem than Blavatsky was.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Time are different also, politically and historically.
Yeah.
Also. Mm-hmm. But would you talk about unification of Germany for what happened in 1990?
In 1919?
1990.
No, it's construction.
Okay. Then it's fair enough. Then it's fair enough. Then it's okay.
There's some Eastern population from Asia that came to the democratic part of Germany.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Which was one? Which one? The Eastern one or the Western?
Democratic.
Since you say democratic, now it becomes confused. Okay.
Yeah, Pat.
I was going to say, I started out with the discussion on the reception of Theosophical society in different countries, thinking you're dealing with special cases for especially developing, reunifying, God forbid we should use the term risorgimento kinds of countries who are coming out of some sort of sleep or oblivion and rising into some new consciousness. And then I thought, well, that can't be right, because how about France? And then I realized the French Theosophical Society became fascinated with the Celts.
The Druids.
And Druids.
Yes, absolutely.
But then, the mind being what it always is, I kept it, well, the United States. I don't think the United States ever used Theosophy in a nationalist sense, although there's
Because they are the universe.
There
can really be universal.
was a journal by American socialist called the Nationalist, and he was a Theosophist. But it wasn't quite, it was more of a socialist thing than any American nationalist thing. And I don't think the United States ever sought for its roots in the Rom coming over and bringing culture and all this kind of crap, because they're so removed from it. You know what I mean? And there's so many cultures. So maybe it is still a question of special conditions in the recipient country that lets it be one thing or another.
Well, I would say Mormonism is doing that. So it would be interesting to see kind of connections between Mormonism and the Theosophical movement in America, if there were any. But Mormonism is doing probably something like what we are talking about here. The kind of construction of a past that, primordial past that gives a meaning also to a present and especially to a religious tradition. So, but okay, well.
I think we're out of time, so thank you very much, Martha.
Yes.